Well, it's really good to see you guys. Okie doke. So it's lovely to be here, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the session. My name is Henry Warren, and I'm the former Director of Innovation for Pearson PLC. And I currently chair the education company Watobi in Africa and the charity Turn on the Subtitles here in the UK and in the US. And I'm going to be your chair today. So we have a great panel of guests joining us from across the globe, Sierra Leone, Pakistan, the US, and I'm actually joining you from London, which is actually beautifully sunny for once, which is mildly disconcerting. So here we go. At the beginning of 2020, we had roughly 263 million children out of school. We have a teacher shortage of over 1.6 million teachers. And in many cases, profound issues around teacher truancy, lack of training and resources for those that are actually employed. Whilst huge strides have been made in the Millennium and latterly the Sustainable Development Goals, it's clear we have a very long way to go. The panel today are going to be focusing on the millions of children who are not in any kind of education. Can we better understand the problems and what might some of the solutions be? So on that, let me introduce my guests. Starting, we have Professor Tahir Andrabi, who is the prominent economist, researcher, and education leader. Tahir is the Stedman Sumner Professor of Economics at Sonoma College. He was the inaugural dean at the London School of Education from 2017 to 2020. He's the principal investigator for research in systems of education and the Learning and Education Achievement in Pakistan Schools research program. Welcome, Professor. Next up, we have Stephanie Dobrowolski, who is the Chief Impact Officer at Rising Academies. Steph is the co-founder and Chief Impact Officer at Rising Academies, a growing network of schools in West Africa. Her focus is on effectively delivering quality education at scale and achieving learning gains for all students. Stephanie has a DPhil in social intervention from the University of Oxford. Next up, we have Mosharraf Zaidi, who is a leading public policy analyst, senior fellow at the Tabad Lab. Now, Mosharraf has advised governments and international organizations on international aid, education, technology, and trade. Until 2013, he was the principal advisor to the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, where he established the ministry's public diplomacy unit. In 2013, he founded the Alif Alan campaign for education in Pakistan. Thank you all for joining us. And a special thank you to Tahir, who it is the middle of the night, I believe, roughly 1 in the morning. So now I have a number of my own questions, but I find that these conferences work so much better when we can take questions from the audience. So please do write in on the chat window and we'll tackle as many of these as we can. So I'd like to start, though, first of all, with a question to Tahir, if you're not too tired. I'd love to kind of put a little bit of colour on that 263 million children number. I'd love to understand both the geographic spread and how much do we really know about these children that are out of school?
Okay. I guess if you're talking about Pakistan, that's what I'll mostly talk about, not the rest of the world. And in Pakistan, the number that we think about in terms of out-of-school kids goes anywhere between like 18 million out-of-school children to about 20 plus million out-of-school children. So I think there is some margin of error, but roughly we're talking about that order of magnitude. When we think of out-of-school children, we think about the age range of roughly 5 to 15 or 5 to 16. So that typically the ranges in which we think that all kids should be in school. And I think that these 20 million or so kids are evenly divided across those years. And what I would say is that we should really think about the bottom age group of that population, talking about like 5 to 11 or so, in a very different vein than kids out of school who are 11 to 16 or 12 to 16. And that is because Pakistan has a very curious phenomenon which it shares with a lot of rural economies and countries around the world, which is it has very delayed and staggered enrollment. So Pakistani enrollment, kids will keep on entering school around age 11. Pakistani enrollment peaks at age 11, actually, which is really interesting in the data. So you have more 8 or 9-year-old kids coming into school, 10-year-old kids. So I think the first thing is to focus on those kids. So delayed enrollment creates its own issues. And I think a lot of the out-of-school kids is that. Then you have this crucial time period, which girls comes around puberty, and boys, it starts coming around when they enter the labor market in terms of child labor, which is the 12, 13, 14 years. And I think that's where we can intervene also. But then there is the larger age group, which is like 14, 15, 16, kids who have been out of school for a while. So one has to think about a very different strategy for them. So I would really stratify them. The second thing, which we know a lot about these kids from different data sources, but there's a lot we don't know from the country point of view. And one thing that I think we really don't understand fully, and that's a particularly Pakistan problem, is the geographical spread as to where these kids are. I mean, are these 20 million, how are they evenly distributed? Are they mostly in the cities? Are we talking about the villages? And the reason we don't is because of its own curious problems, and Pakistan government needs a rap on its knuckles on that, is that they haven't released the disaggregated population census, which was done in 2018. Because we don't have that, we really do not know the child distribution in any village in Pakistan, which I think as a social scientist or a policy analyst is crucial to do these kinds of things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's utterly fascinating. Steph, I'd like to come on to you now. Now, Rising works with children in some of the poorest places on the planet. I think you're currently right now in Freetown. Can you tell us a little bit about what Rising does? And could you tell us about some of the things that you've been doing that possibly we might be able to take forward to support these huge numbers of children that are not in school?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So Rising Academies, as you mentioned, is a growing network of schools in West Africa. And we're focusing on improving the quality of education. We currently have a network of just over 170 schools, and we're serving close to 50,000 students, both through schools that we own and operate ourselves, so through a low-fee private school model, but also schools that we work in partnerships with government. And a lot of those schools are in some of the hardest to reach most marginalized communities in these countries. And I think, a lot of our work, obviously, in the last few months has been really focusing on how do we reach these children with schools being closed. So all of our schools have been closed for the past few months. And I think especially because of our experiences working here during Ebola, where we saw the government switch to radio-based education, we very quickly redesigned our curriculum content for radio delivery. So it was actually pretty impressive. Within 2 weeks of schools closing in both Sierra Leone and Liberia, the government was broadcasting education programs nationally. And we were a part of that effort. So we launched a program called Rising on Air, where we have developed radio scripts for foundational skills in reading and maths. And those are all radio scripts that we've been making freely available on our website. And so those are now being used by organizations in over 20 different countries, including in Pakistan as well. And so I think that these last few months have really, in some ways, I think, challenged our thinking in important ways, because it's reminded us of, in some ways, our starting points during Ebola, and how did we have to be more flexible and adaptable and reach kids in their homes. I think it's also heightened our awareness of the priorities. We can't do everything. We can't teach every subject. So let's make sure we're focusing on the foundational skills. Those are relevant for all children. And I think it's reminded us too of all the challenges that our kids face on a day-to-day basis. We can be trying to deliver these programs, but so much of what parents and families are aware of right now are their concerns with their daily livelihoods, with their concerns about health. And so I think during this period, we've been so much more aware of how best do we engage families and communities. And I think all of these strategies will be strategies that we continue to use even when schools reopen. We'll continue to do radio-based learning. We'll continue to use SMS with reaching parents. And I think hopefully we'll continue to provide these resources as well to organizations in other geographies.
And do you have any data on the efficacy of this kind of transfer towards predominantly radio delivery?
Yeah, it's a great question. We get asked that very often. Do these radio lessons actually work? And it's like, well, this is the first time we've done it. So no, we don't have any data, but we are collecting a lot of data along the way. And it's been really interesting getting feedback from parents, from our teachers, from our students. We've piloted and have since been using a phone-based learning assessment, which we validated against the ACER. So we are collecting data along the way. We are learning as we go. And I think that's been such an important part of this time for us is, we're new to radio, we're new to SMS. Let's do this for a few weeks. Let's gather feedback. Let's see how do we iterate and improve. And hopefully by, the end of the next few months, we should have really great data. And we're also part of a small randomized control trial that the Center for Global Development is conducting of these remote learning strategies that we're doing as well. So we should have good data to answer that question in a few months.
That's great. And there are other organisations around around Africa that are trialing the use of radio. I know there's a wonderful company called Ubongo coming out of Tanzania that's doing some great stuff there. I imagine their data will also be used in the mix. So Mosharraf, the elephant in the room here is obviously COVID-19. It's the foremost topic at this conference. But I wonder what impact you see this having on our ability to reduce the number of children out of school.
Thanks, Stephen. Look, I hate to do this. I want to answer your question, but I just wanted to address something that Tahir said in his presentation about what we know about the out-of-school children population in Pakistan. So actually, fundamentally, he's absolutely right. There isn't a regular enough and consistent enough publication of official data. But what we do have is the most recent data, and that actually articulates pretty in quite a lot of detail the distribution. One thing that I think is really problematic is for us to work with the assumption that there is an even distribution across age groups, because there actually isn't. The overwhelming number of out-of-school children are above primary age. And I think the reason that's important is because there is an oversupply of primary with respect to non-primary. So middle and high schools constitute less than 20% of the total government supply of schooling. And this skewing is a little less pronounced in the private sector simply because of market dynamics. There is just not enough middle and high schools in the country. And that is one of the main reasons that Pakistan has a huge out-of-school population. Again, the official government number, most recent number from the 1617 statistics handbook is over 22 million. Knowing what we know about this topic is really important for how we deal with the topic of COVID-19, because in a sense, the mistakes that perhaps we've all been making with respect to the way we frame the education conversation, how many kids are out of school, how many are in school, and what's the fastest and cheapest way of putting a child in school, which is simply a physical activity. Like it's like how many sheep can you put in the shed? It's not, or it's how many units of cement you can put in the shed. There's no conversation about what happens to a child when they're put in this place called a school. And so the COVID-19 conversation is really interesting, because the conversation really is, do we have enough 4G? Do we have enough tablets? Do we have enough phones? And that conversation is exactly a replication, a digital age replication of the schoolhouse conversation. Do we have enough schoolhouses? Which I argue and have argued in terms of my day-to-day daily job for a big chunk of my life, saying we don't have enough school buildings and we don't have enough teachers. But these are all supply side issues, and they're issues that are zeros and ones. You either have it or you don't. We all know that cognitive and non-cognitive skills and how those skills are absorbed and how they're manifest in behavior how they're assessed. All of those questions are not 0-1 questions. So to me, the real question in the COVID-19 conversation is, do we want to replace physical buildings, brick and mortar, with tablets and 5G connections? Or do we want to use this moment to reassess what it is that we're talking about when we talk about these kids that are out of school? What is the thing that an out-of-school child is being robbed of? And what is it that a in-school child is potentially also being robbed of, but is becoming a ghost because we're only looking at the 0-1 of it? Is the child in school or not in school? So,
yeah, I mean, do you think the current model, Mosharraf, do you think the current model of education is actually viable in the 21st century? If not, what do you think should replace it?
Well, this is where, you know, the word analyst after policy, you know, really helps, because when we get asked questions like that, we tell you what the problem is, but then we charge a lot of money for the solution, partially because we don't have a solution. I mean, that's the whole consulting model, as we all know. Look, we know that this paradigm is badly, I don't think it's broken per se, but I think it was designed for Charles Dickens. And that's like, I mean, now it's 2020. So like, even sort of, you know, the baggage from being like an 80s kid or 90s kid, like that's all done. We're so far removed from the world for which the schoolhouse model was developed. And sadly, because of the massive capitalization of high-end learning, and, you know, the kind of stuff we hear about the Elon Musk school and those kinds of advanced approaches to learning, there is no government on the planet that has the tax revenue or the appetite to get into a tax revenue conversation that can then deliver the alternative paradigm. So what we've done instead, and this is again a point of contention probably between me and many friends, but this idea that herding kids into school, and if the governments can't do it, we'll get low-cost private schools to solve the problem, is a ridiculous notion. Because at least with the government schools, you have some certainty of system. But with the low-cost private solution, and we've seen this play out not just in Pakistan, but in a lot of countries since about March, that they've been running from pillar to post and using all resources available to wail about how urgently they need to reopen schools. There's no conversation coming from their end that has anything to do with duty of care to public health or to children's health or to the grandparents of those children or the little villages that it takes to raise those children. Because right now, these low-cost private schools are in a life and death struggle to survive. The survival of business entities driving the conversation on whether schools should be open or not is a serious challenge. And it's not to demonize low-cost private schools. They are a part of the solution. But so much of the discourse, at least in Pakistan today, is being entirely driven by private schools and low-cost private schools, that the public health aspects of this conversation get ignored.
Steph, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, no, that was very interesting, because it is just it's a very different conversation in West Africa. There isn't, you know, the private school as a sector is very fragmented. There is no kind of strong, unified lobbyist voice. And it is certainly not the case that the rhetoric here is that low-cost private schools are pushing for schools to reopen. You know, in Freetown, we have 8 low-fee private schools. We're not in any position to be really kind of swaying government decisions. And we also work in partnership with government. The vast majority of the schools that we work in, we are contracted to government. And so we will, you know, we have to, you know, listen to what their wants are and follow suit. So I think, you know, similarly in Ghana, where we work, it is a very large but very fragmented market, and there isn't the same kind of strong kind of unified voice pushing in a certain direction. And I think even still, like with our private schools, we ultimately serve the parents, and a lot of our parents here have concerns with their health, the health of their children, and they're not pushing for schools to reopen, and they're ultimately our customers. But I think, you know, a point that has been raised, you know, that I very much agree with is this point of kind of a yes or no, you're either in school, you're out of school. And a couple of things came to mind for me on that is that we have a lot of children who are in and out of school. We have kids who attend on certain days, they're out other days because of market, they're out during particular times of the year because of seasonal work. So there's also this kind of transient group that I think is very difficult to understand or to have kind of reliable data on. And the other point is just because you're in school definitely does not mean you're learning. And the quality of education in these countries where we work is shockingly poor. We have students who they complete 6 years of 6 years of primary education, and only 1 in 20 can read a basic sentence like the child is reading a book. That's after 6 years of sitting in a classroom. So just because a child is in school and you can tick that box, yes, absolutely does not mean that they are, achieving any sort of gains in learning or that the needle is moving on actual, quality learning outcomes.
Yeah, that's fascinating and also extremely depressing. It echoes what I've been seeing across Africa and the Asian subcontinent. I mean, the standard of education is just pretty woeful across the piece. I want to bring us on to education technology, which I think for a long time has thoroughly underdelivered in terms of overall efficacy and frankly profitability for many of the companies that have tried to work in this space. But I think we're starting to see some changes here. So just recently, Baiju in India is now being valued at over 10 billion and makes it the first EdTech decacorn. And this is seeing children learning at home. So this is a sell to parents. Do you think this is an anomaly, or do you think this is part of a systemic change that we're seeing? Let's go with Tahir.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was EdTech's moment, right? I mean, with this massive school disruption, and I don't think they were ready to really deliver. I mean, I think it's all fragmented kind of approaches. I mean, I've talked a lot to that people in terms of what they're doing. I think we need to move forward along those lines. But in terms of whether it's a magic pill to deliver at this moment, I think that's something that really hasn't happened. There are some elements of it that work, but the last mile about blending, about how does it interact with households, how does it interact within schools. We have some studies on certain types of small things working in terms of adaptive lessons, personalized learning. Those kinds of interventions at small scale seem to have effect for populations which are, let's say rural and poor. But generically for large scale interventions, for EdTech, I think it has been somewhat disappointing. I want to make one point which is very important coming forward in this learning disruption, and that is that this disruption has created increases in learning inequality, right? Pakistan and many other countries were already very unequal in terms of learning outcomes. I have a study which is coming out of the earthquake, 2005, where we see huge learning inequalities coming out of the earthquake. But the interesting part is that a lot of that inequality was not coming directly from the disruption, but from the fact that schools did not calibrate up to the disruption. So I'll come back to what Stephanie talked earlier. I think that right now, the best hope that we can do is think about, we have to salvage the rest of this academic year. Otherwise, this whole generation is going to be seriously in trouble. And the only way we can do it is to recalibrate in terms of, foundational skills. There's no way in hell, Pakistan, the worst thing we can do is go back to business as usual, which is to go back and think that nothing has happened and schools are going to continue. Kids are tremendously behind. Poorer kids have fallen even more behind. Now, technology can come into play, but I just don't see it playing a big role right now in the recovery from this pandemic. I really would like schools to focus on foundational skills, and we have a chance now that we can teach to the child. So I'm very much in thinking about technology and any other institutional change that you can do on teaching to the child. Pakistan has too much heterogeneity in learning across kids. So we need to really be able to think about personalized instruction. So there is some technology that we are exploring along those lines. Otherwise, I just find it more hype than anything else.
Mosharraf, what do you you think on that? Do you think that EdTech has singularly failed on this?
Well, I think that EdTech was never tested, and in a sense, COVID-19 didn't really test EdTech. It tested our notion of brick and mortar being replaced by digital, which was a problematic supposition or assumption to begin with. It was never going to be able to do that. There's been a real, I think, wake-up call for a lot of EdTech startups that are composed of coders who care about the world and who personally are invested in education as an idea, who maybe have a personal story, either within their family or themselves. And so they've entered the field of EdTech without actually understanding the tech in ed rather than the ed tech. And the tech in ed, of course, is the interaction between a learner and a person who is responsible for that learning process, the curator of that learning process. In the cases where probably a lot of us that are watching and in this conversation, the primary curator and caregiver is at home. And a lot of the debate around countries, whether it's Africa or it's a country like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, in these poorer countries, that given or that assumed caregiving and curation function is not being fulfilled. So from the get-go, you have this, what we call digital divide really starts even pre-birth. Are the neonatal supplements that a mother is taking within the first trimester of a pregnancy, giving the fetus of that, that woman is carrying bigger advantage in life, cognitively and otherwise, than the ones that aren't? And of course, the answer is yes. We have reams of scientific data that proves that that's where where people start getting left behind in the race. The EdTech conversation also, essentially, because it's replacing the brick and mortar conversation, is going to exacerbate the digital divide. Everywhere where there aren't schools, it's hard to find 5G transmission towers. Everywhere where there aren't government schools, and it's very rare in Pakistan, but in those pockets where there are none, then there's nothing else either. So the notion that this could potentially replace is entirely missing. You need EdTech startups that are designed, conceived, and run by teachers, and teachers that have failed and teachers that have succeeded, because it's that experience of curating the learning journey that is actually the most important bit of the EdTech, not the C++ or the Visual Basic. Of course, I'm probably exposing how old I am by using those references, but there's a big difference between EdTech and tech in ed.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that from personal experience, though one of the biggest challenges actually comes from teachers going into education businesses, not just specifically tech, but then really struggling with how to scale. I mean, education technology is famous for being a wonderful way to turn a large fortune into a small fortune. But I'd like to kind of focus us more on solutions. Forgive me, Mosharraf, I know your background as an analyst, but I'd like to look at how do we actually start to tackle some of these huge problems. And Steph, obviously, in your own way, you're doing some amazing stuff there with some of the poorest kids on the planet. But I'd love to just throw to you now and get your view on how do we really start to make a dent into these numbers?
Yeah, it's interesting because the tech conversation just always feels, at least for the communities where we work, just so disconnected. Because when we're talking about tech solutions, we're largely talking about radio, SMS, a phone call. We're the communities where we are working. It is not necessarily the case that they have 2G coverage, and they may not have radio signal. So when we're talking about tech, and especially the solutions that we're using at the moment, because of the school closures due to COVID, we're talking about low tech. I don't know if that's the correct technical term, but it is old tech. And I think part of what's been really interesting and exciting about this is still the thoughtfulness required in the design of the content. You can't just kind of take a classroom-based lesson and put that on the air. That's not going to work. So how do you redesign your content for the method of delivery? How do you also really imagine the context within which that child is going to be engaging in this form of learning? They're going to be in a home with no resources, but other children around, other adults around. And so how do you actually make it a more engaging, participatory kind of learning experience? And I think that has a lot of potential. But I think in general, these more kind of tablet-based app, kind of personalized learning experiences, they're just so disconnected from the realities of where a lot of our kids live, but also the kind of thoughtfulness required for that implementation is what I don't feel like I have seen. Who is really thinking through from the point at which tablets are shipped into this country all the way through, a child improving in their foundational reading scores in a remote village? What are all the steps that have to happen, and how do you do that well, and how do you do that thoughtfully in communities where power is going to be a problem, the weather is awful, and you have to know how to store things properly? Like, how are you figuring out all of the details of thoughtful implementation of technology? Because simply dropping a laptop or a tablet into, the hands of a child is not going to achieve the kind of silver bullet learning outcomes that we're hoping to see. But I think that to me is really the piece that I think some organizations are doing really well, but in general, like seeing that really thoughtful testing is what I would love to see more of.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you can just parachute as you say, a laptop into the middle of the bush and suddenly learning will emerge, I mean, was kind of disproven by the one laptop per child experiments, 10 or so years ago. I mean, the good news is that there is some great stuff coming out. There was the Learning X Prize recently, which was won by a couple of different companies. One here in the UK called 1 Billion that actually have managed to do pretty much that. They've focused very much on the pedagogy, the implementation, what the devices need to look like, how locked down they are, and actually the learning results that they have seen have been pretty spectacular. I mean, more than 2x what they're seeing in local schools. But I think I'd like to kind of go back to like a policy kind of space. I mean, what advice would you give governments who are looking to achieve 100% in enrollment, both in primary and secondary? Mosharraf, can you talk a little bit about that? What advice would you give governments around the world?
Well, until schools become cost and policy centers, these conversations will continue to be dominated by policy elites that are more comfortable talking about national and at best subnational or provincial frameworks. Pakistan's a great, I think, case study on that front. It's a country of 220 million people, roughly 60 plus million that are of school-going age. But the problems that children face in the metropolitan city of Karachi, population of just under 20 million, versus the problems faced by people who have the same citizenship, live in the same country, and are treated essentially the same way by passport scanning machines all over the world. There's places where there's no sign of urban anything, where even finding a school building is difficult. If you're treating an area that was subject to the Afghan conflict over the last 40 years in terms of bombs falling from the sky and onto your sort of extended backyard versus a major world metropolis, you're treating those two places in the exact same way, then you're neither serving the kids in the big city nor the kids in the barren mountainous village. And I think that until you don't have a localization and bespoking of policy, you're not going to make any progress. And the solution isn't the long route, which is find a way to design local governments that cater to every aspect of the elite before you solve the problem, versus find a way to create schools as cost and policy centers within whatever framework of governance you have. Even if it's a totally centralized model, you still need schools to be governed from where they are rather than from hundreds or in some cases thousands of miles away.
It sounds to me like you're advocating for low-cost private schools, Mosharraf.
I think, you'll find my resistance to this has been 2 decades long, and in the face of some some people who are very, very dear to me, including Dr. Andrabi and many, many other teachers of mine over the years. I don't, as I said, low-cost private schools are not the problem, but presenting low-cost private schools as the solution is a big problem. So I think people who are advocating for low-cost private schools need to be clear about what it is that they want to argue with me. If the argument is that low-cost private schools are the solution to Pakistan's education challenge, we have a real argument, and I'm happy to robustly engage in that. If somebody says low-cost private schools are part of a galaxy of instruments that can help solve the problem, thank God they exist, and they absolutely are, but they need to be treated in a manner that is consistent with their actual potential reach, and most importantly, what curation of the learning experience is actually taking place in a low-cost private school.
Interesting. So actually, I want to go back to something that you said at the top of this call, Mosharraf, around what exactly are we teaching children? What is it that we should be inculcating whilst they are in school? I mean, in a world of voice to text, emojis, and even the humblest of phones having a calculator, I mean, how relevant are these skills really now? Are they the skills that we should be pushing? I'm going to go to Stephanie on this. Stephanie, what do you think?
Yes, I think absolutely yes. I just think that, I mentioned it earlier, we have, countries where entire, groups of the population can attend school for 6 years. And at the end of that 6-year experience, we've not equipped them with the skills to read a basic sentence. You could send them a text message that has been auto-corrected, and that doesn't make a difference. They still won't be able to read it. But each and every year of learning that is added, especially for women, for example, increases their chances in life, increases their children's chances in life. I think that now more than ever, those skills are important. That's how individuals participate in society. It's how they, are able to advocate for themselves. It's how they have a voice. I feel like absolutely it is extremely important.
Professor Tahir, do you want to follow on that? Do you think these are the right skills that we should be teaching? You're on mute, sir.
Skills have a certain level of verticality, right? I mean, think about math. If you don't know division, you can't do factorization. If you can't do factorization, you can't do algebra. If you can't do algebra, you can't do calculus. So the verticality means that the mastery at a basic level has to happen. I think that's one of the biggest problems that I see, is that we are moving forward in teaching our kids on these curricula which are so stuffed with things that we do not be able to get some mastery out of our basics. So kids do not know how to apply basic concepts to surroundings other than what they have been immediately taught. So I think that focus on some of the foundational stuff, I think is really important. Now, having said that, I think that there are certain things that we think some of the best schools can have, which certainly don't exist in Pakistan to a large degree, is, for example, thinking about creativity, thinking about collaborative learning, thinking about project-based learning, thinking about more generally anything else other than memorizing your textbook and sitting for an exam. I think that education has been reduced to memorizing your textbook and regurgitating it in a 3-hour exam. That's Pakistani education. And that's education around the world. And by the way, that the 3-hour exam comes from a country which spread education in a lot of these places. So my point is, what we want to see is, and I'm seeing it all the way across, not just in little kids, but even as much as in universities in Pakistan, for example, teamwork. I think that modern economies, modern life requires you to work with other people. There's some fascinating work done in the US that even among wage stagnation, the people who have made more wage increases are people who have been able to work under collaborative circumstances and environments. So this idea of training kids simply on some very narrow cognitive skills, I think is a real issue. Secondly, I think there is a pendulum that goes back and forth between kind of more vocational and technical skills versus more general skills. And I'm old enough to see that pendulum go back and forth a couple of times. And I think it's time for it to go back a little bit more towards the vocational side, which is I've been working with some vocational people in Pakistan where a lot of these skills need to be brought in. So I think that this idea of what is it that you need to succeed in real life can easily be brought back into some more general concepts. And similarly, I think from the employer's point of view, it's very interesting. It's not that the employers know what do they want. I mean, you look at employers' job descriptions, right? I mean, most people are hired on one job description and they end up doing completely something different in their everyday life. So I think this idea of this mismatch in the labor market between employers and schools, I think from both sides need to be worked on because the skills required. I need people, when I hire people, I know what I need. And I know how to test for it. And school is one small part of it.
Okay. I think a lot of these conversations focus on kind of tinkering around the edges of schools. We know that there are intrinsic problems, but I don't think we're really getting to the heart of the big issue here, which is that there are millions and millions of children that are not in school. Or frankly, let me rephrase that are not receiving any form of education. What I'd love to hear from the panel are some big, bold ideas about how we, and maybe people like Beacon House, how can we all start to support these children? I'm going to start with Stephanie on that. Stephanie.
I think these last few months have been a very interesting experience of, at least from our experience, seeing far more urgency in the crisis of education. And it's taken a health crisis to do that. You know, everyone has been talking about this global learning crisis for years. It's not, it's not a new thing for us to be talking about kids in school and not learning. And I think that, we have really seen in the last few months just how much the walls have kind of come down between organizations working in this space, because suddenly now we all share a common crisis. We all are, trying to deal with COVID, trying to deal with kids out of school. Well, arguably there was a common crisis prior. We were all working in a space struggling to do so effectively. We're seeing, kids in school not learning. We're struggling to get kids into school. So what is it about this time that has actually brought people together? And I feel like that is a really important conversation to have, is how do we continue to try to more effectively collaborate together and share the resources we have, share the learnings we have, why is it the case, foundational literacy skills in English are not, arguably any different here than in other English-speaking countries. So how do we leverage these learnings, the resources, the tools, so that we're not all kind of working in our own little spaces trying to solve these problems? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think, part of this is trying to move forward from this place and not just revert back to schools reopen, everyone gets back in that, the box of the school, but also our kind of boxes of our thinking. And to me, that is really, where I see a lot of potential from this point forward, is trying to kind of maintain and build on what is now viewed as this collective crisis.
Tahir, would you like to expand on that? I'd love to hear some big, bold ideas from you.
Yeah, I think that, listen, I can give you something, which is there are lots of kids right now in school. So many more than the out-of-school children kids. There are kids who I would call at risk and vulnerable. So first thing what I can do, right, is to make sure that kids currently in school do not join the ranks of out of school. So which is the dropout problem. I think dropout problem we have a much bigger understanding of. I think that we want to make sure, and I think in this COVID, what we are concerned about is a lot of kids who are kind of marginally attached to schooling right now, that because of this longer disruption and then the economic shock and then the health shock will go out. I think we should focus on those. Those kids are already have a willingness, their families have shown to be in school. Is a huge number. So I think my first order would be to make sure that those kids stay in school. I don't want to add to this number. Second is, I think, as I said, I mean, the smaller group of kids, which is the 5 to 9 to 5 to 11 group, I think we can really work with them in terms of making their schooling experience much more focused. We have lots of now evidence on what we can predict dropouts. So to get them into school, the focus on the 11 to 12, I think we have to just realize that. But that young girls, when they start maturing, that's also this transition to secondary. I think that transition we can focus on a lot. So around that age, I can do the other groups, the larger group, which is the 12 to 16 group, which has been out of school for a while. I think that I would really think in terms of getting back from like vocational skills. That's where I think you would need a lot more out of the box experiments of how to really get them back into some sort of a skilling program. So that's what I would do.
Okay. Mosharraf?
Yeah, just picking up from where Tahir's left off there, you know, this transition between primary and middle is the single biggest it's the single biggest ravine in the education journey. And right now we're talking about in school in the traditional way, because unfortunately,
can you just say for those who are joining us internationally, where that's what age group that happens at?
It's the transition between sort of 10 and 11-year-olds to 12 and 13-year-olds. So what we call primary is grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then 6 is middle. The drop off, again, if there's 100 government schools in Pakistan, 80 plus of those are primary schools, and then about 16 are middle schools, and then about 4 are high schools. One really quick solution is to overnight convert all primary schools into middle schools. Now, this obviously would create a massive, it's not doable, because 4 different provinces and the regions would have to make separate policy decisions, which I think is doable. But the second part is the gender mixing and the co-ed versus non-co-ed. And those are all debates that are live, whether we like them or not, unfortunately or fortunately. So I think, you know, in terms of a big, bold idea, you can have a substantial impact on enrollment. Again, just going back to the numbers, in the most recent official data published, 17.2 million kids are in school at the primary age, and that drops to 6.2 million at the middle school age. So the 5 to 9 plus, or almost 10, is 17 million, and then the 10, 11, 12, 13 is 6.2 million. So you see that's like a 10 million plus drop off. And that's because there's a pipeline issue. You have a big pipeline, 80 inches in diameter or 8 inches in diameter, and that shrinks to 1.5 inch or 15 inches. It's a massive pipeline issue. I think the other sort of, you know, really challenge for all of us is to be realistic about what's about to happen. If you look at the US and you look at countries like Pakistan, and a lot of other large countries, I think it is going back to business as usual in less than 2 months. September 15th is when they've focused in on the date here in Pakistan. Similar dates all around the world. The pressures are not just from low-cost private schools. They're not the only bad guys. There's lots of working moms and dads that will lose their jobs if they don't go to work, and the only place where their kids can go is to school. There are lots and lots of governments that are deeply concerned legitimately about what Tahir Andrabi is saying, because lots of governments actually listen to people like Tahir Andrabi and Stephanie Dobrowolski and Henry Warren, and they say, look, we have a massive learning crisis on our hands already. After 6 weeks of being out of school, and Tahir has done a lot of research on this because of his experience with what happened to kids once the earthquake hit in Pakistan. We had an earthquake in 2005, and a lot of the wisdom that, you know, that drives Pakistani policymaking and academic elites is from that experience of the 2005 earthquake. You suddenly had massive drops in safety, security, learning, all across the range of, you know, what we would be interested in for people that that weren't born with a golden or a silver spoon. So I think the real challenge is going to be, as we go back to business as usual, what are the insertions that we can afford? What are the little minds that we can plug in to this new business as usual? Because business as usual is absolutely already coming. I cannot think of any big country. Finland and Singapore, are always going to be exceptions, and I think part of it has to do with their size and the fact that you can actually, at a granular level, you could potentially look at a list of every kid in school, and it wouldn't take your whole life. You can't do that in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan or Mexico or even some of the larger advanced economies in old Europe.
We're getting a whole load of questions coming through, and thank you so much to those that are doing so. Please do send more. I've got one here. There will no doubt be a number of education entrepreneurs tuning in to this event, and I wonder if you could point them at some specific problems that you feel desperately need solving that might suit an entrepreneurial mindset. Can we go to, let's go to Tahir, please, for that. You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, I am. I think that there is what is called a pivot to opportunity here. That's what we are trying to think about. And to just take off from what Mosharraf said, listen, the education debate and discussion that we are having here and that a lot of us are having with other people and others, I find it quite fruitful. What the debate that is really lacking behind is the public health debate. Okay, we have to just understand that. I mean, I have no guidance from public health people on what to do and how to open schools. Okay, it is actually that leadership in public health in terms of education. I have no idea how this disease is transmitted, what happens to kids, what happens to teachers, all of that, right? So we have to understand that there is a big vacuum in terms of and trying to expect education people to tell us about school openings, Mosharraf. That's just can't happen. And the public health people in Pakistan, and I just came to the US 2 days ago, here in the US, they're really far behind. Nobody is really telling us what a school should look like, what happens. There's lots of different models, etc. On the entrepreneurial side, the pivot to opportunity, I really think, is individual-based learning. I think that our schools, I mean, you talked about Dickens, are really 19th century models of getting who thinks that this is the best way to educate kids? Put 40 kids or 30 kids in one classroom, teach them exactly the same thing every day. That model just doesn't work. It doesn't work here in a village in Pakistan. It doesn't work here in Claremont, California. So I think the reality is we have to go towards more and more individualized learning. The heterogeneity among kids, among parental backgrounds, among the resources available to them, among the quality of the teachers available to them is just too large. So I think that's really where technology has to come in. And I think that one of the ways to do it, which I think that, if I'll tell you what I'm looking for, it will be a big help to me, is if I can get rapid, useful assessment of kids on multi-dimensions. It's really costly. I spend a lot of time doing that with kids. It takes me forever to be able to get good assessment on what these kids know, what these kids don't know. If we can get adaptive testing, I've seen questions on AI and all this on the chat box. Well, that's where I need it, is if I can get rapid adaptive assessment of kids, which can get back to teachers very quickly in a formative way, then the teacher can create a customized lesson plan for that kid. I think that's the promise of technology that we should be working on. If I can do that, I think we can really work at the kids at the bottom of the pool here.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Stephanie, I'm just going to, one of the questions that's come through here, I think pertains best to you, which is, can the school systems impart education to all the students that have underprivileged parents?
I mean, it's difficult, but I think that it goes back to, what the professor was just describing, is that there is such a range of kind of learning levels within the same classroom. And that is, differentiated instruction is a very difficult thing for a teacher in any context. And I think, this potential for technology to play a role and to be a really useful tool in a classroom is where, hopefully we can unlock a lot more of the potential and really reach kids that are, your most struggling students in a classroom. And I think, you mentioned earlier, Henry, 1 Billion. They are an organization that we've been speaking with, that we're trying to see how best to partner with. How do you, their use of that technology in the classroom is really not about kind of having a student in their own sort of individualized learning bubble, but how are they using technology within the context of facilitation happening by teachers, and how is this individualized learning data actually being informative in the teaching and learning cycle? And that, seeing technology as part of the teaching and learning process as opposed to kind of this standalone solution is really helpful for kind of a teacher in front of the room of 35 kids, or in some classrooms 50 kids or 70 kids. How are they how are they better understanding where their kids at? How are they progressing? Where do they need more support? Because I think, we've seen that. We've seen kids who've come in, who started in grade 7, who are 12 and 13, they come in with essentially no reading skills. It's possible. It's definitely possible to catch these kids up, but it's difficult. And I think to the extent that you can have useful tools to enable that, I think there's a lot of potential in technology.
So we've got a few minutes left on this, so I'm going to ask the same question to all three of you. This conference has been very kindly set up by Beacon House Schools, and I wonder, what could Beacon House do? What could Beacon House do to help solve some of these problems across the world? Is it about bringing the right people together? Is it about funding something? I don't know. Mosharraf, I'd like to go to you first.
Well, I think the bigger, to me, what Beacon House has already done merits examination and, at least to me, celebration. When Beacon House started, Beacon House has been around for almost the entirety of my life. In many ways, Beacon House has helped inform the story of Pakistan over the last 4 decades. And one of those storylines, there's a lot that gets spoken about in terms of this country's failures, and there are many of them, so there's lots to talk about. But one of the more interesting and I think exciting storylines over my lifetime in this country has been the emergence of a massive sort of pool of global talent, Pakistanis who you can plug into any office space, any conversation, any television screen, any lab in the world, and they would be at home. That production facility, I mean, it's not only Beacon House, but there's a lot of blue and yellow on that production facility. And I think that the driving heart and soul of that has been the ability of the Beacon House group to engage with young and middle-aged urban women in particular, and convert them from curators of their children's learning journey to curators of the learning journey for groups of 20, 30, 40 kids over 1, 2, 3 decades. I can name many sort of, icons, but it's a long list. We have now teachers who have retired, who are, there's a whole generation of retired Beacon House teachers who are responsible for putting in place this emergent urban Pakistani middle class that has both global credentials, but also global aspirations. So a lot of the middle class
I'm just going to ask you to pause there for a second, because we have 1 minute left. I have a feeling we're just going to get cut off. So I'm going to ask for 30 seconds quickly on that from Tahir, and then Stephanie. Go.
Okay, I agree with Mosharraf. I think that education is a very gendered field. I think that what most people don't realize, even with low-cost private schools, is the whole role of women as teachers. I think that developing this whole class of female professionals as teachers and then rising up through the ranks through this, the Beacon House career ladder in the headquarters and moving them around, I think that's a really big contribution. I think that as the labor market becomes more professionalized for women, I think we're going to see bigger benefits. The second thing is really a system. I think that, to develop a system, I work with both the government and I've done some research on Beacon House itself. The idea of managing large systems of education, I think in government can learn a lot from them. In fact, I'm advising them right now on some issues in terms of kind of what Mosharraf was saying about breaking down this into smaller units and smaller groups in terms of management of these schools.
We have 2 seconds left, so I'm just going to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us. And I think we have now been cut off. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, thank you so much for your time, guys. It's been really, really appreciated. Oh,
thank you, sir. Mosharraf. Really wonderful.
Apparently, we shouldn't be cut off. I'm not sure. I am going to cut us off. I think we're probably done. Thank you so much. It's been extremely interesting and slightly strange talking into the ether. Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Thanks very much.